All right, so let's get into it. Your two sheets are kind of going to be our guide. And just to review where we've been and why we're going where we are today, we've been looking at the question that somebody asked months ago that wanted to look at together, which is what are the marks of Christian maturity? That was the question. And it's a good question. I think it's a question all of us should be wondering at some point, because we want to be mature. That's our goal. Our goal is not just to make it to a place called heaven. Our goal is to become mature in Christ, to be like Christ. So I think a wonderful question. That's why I want to take time to look at it. Anyway, what I decided to do in that process was to look at the Sermon on the Mount, because and I gave you a list in the original package here. I gave you a list of other scriptures to look at. We might look at some of those together. But to me, the greatest picture of the kingdom life, of the kingdom heart, is what Jesus gave us in Matthew 5 through 7. When I say greatest, I mean all in one place, of course. The scriptural picture altogether is amazing. So anyways, we've been looking at that, and Matthew 5 verse 20 has kind of been what I've presented as the hinge thought here. I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of the heavens. That's kind of been our filter statement for everything we've looked at. So Jesus goes on to show how their righteousness is not enough. Here's what true righteousness looks like, right? Theirs is shallow, just trying to follow rules. True righteousness is deep love for God and others. Yeah. So then we got to this part in chapter 6 last week, where the overall point Jesus makes is that if you do what is right and what is admirable to be admired by people, what did he say? Well, let's go back and just remind ourselves what he said. Would somebody read Matthew 6, 1 through 4?
Watch out. Don't do good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do it as hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth. Goggles and streets I tell you the truth. They have received all the reward they will get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gift in private, and your Father, who sees everything, will reward you.
All right. And so remember, this is Jesus' main point, is that true righteousness, acts of righteousness are done for Father. Out of love for Father, out of trust for Father, or trust in Father. And then he gives us 3 examples. So what are the 3? The first one is what Cindy just read, which is giving to the needy. What are the other 2 examples he gives after that? Probably in your headings.
Doing it in private.
Well, but what are the specific 2 acts that he brings up after that? Prayer and what's the third one? Fasting. All right. As we talked about last week, in the older NIV, they had this phrase, acts of righteousness, in verse 1. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men. And they put the phrase acts of righteousness in quotation marks, which I think was a really good thing. I kind of wish they would have kept it that way, because what that indicates, that phrase represents what the Jews would have considered the cardinal acts of righteousness. It was almost like a catchphrase for these are the things that every good Jew's got to do, you know. And so guess what 3 of those happen to be? Giving to the needy, praying, and fasting. So Jesus chose these well. He chose them on purpose to make his point. And he said, even if you do all the acts of righteousness on your list, but you do them the wrong way, you're not righteous anyway, right? So he's not trying to discourage anyone. He's trying to clarify for everyone. This is a heart issue. This is a heart issue. So what I want to do is, because Jesus brought up these 3 things, I thought we should try to understand them as best we can the way he would have, the way his Jewish audience would have. Because the Jews were right when they put these 3 in their list. They were correct. The Old Testament made it so clear that these are three key parts of the righteous life. So I thought, since Jesus brought him up, let's dig in. He's our master. We'll trust his judgment on this thing. So that's why we've got a whole separate packet here about the giving to the poor or caring for the poor. Just to start with this first introductory paragraph, it's on the back of your first page here. And the heading says, a fundamental mark of maturity. Under both the Old and New Covenants, compassion for and generosity to the poor are basics of life in God's kingdom. I think that's an important statement, because what we're going to see just in the Old Testament, that's what this packet is focused on. Because what I want to do is bring us up to the point where Jesus speaks. So the New Testament has a lot to say about it too, but it comes after what Jesus says here. So I just wanted to get us up to speed to what Jesus says when he says what he does here in chapter 6. So both covenants, both groups of God's righteous ones, whether it's Israel or the church, which includes Israel, giving to the poor is just ABCs. This is not super Christian stuff. This is not for the super holy. This is basic stuff. In this short study, we want to see the heart of our Father and our Master in regards to the poor and what our role is in caring for them. So that's just kind of what this whole packet's about. Now, what you're going to see are those two things mentioned there. What is the heart of God? That's going to be the first section here. And the second is, and then what is our part in doing what he says he'll do in this world? On the last page is really just a summary, my summary of why Jesus had to make corrections about the issue. Because remember, he said in Matthew 5:17, he didn't come to abolish the law of the prophets. What did he say? I came to fulfill them. So on the last page is just my reflections on how did he do that in this particular issue. How did he fulfill the law for us? All right, so that's the plan. Now, I didn't put this in your papers, but I did want to look at it together. One of the issues that always pops up in conversations about helping the poor or helping needy people, and it's a real issue we have to wrestle with if we don't want to be naive about things, is that there are different types of poor. Or you might say there's different causes of poverty. And I think a lot of us have been either burned or afraid of getting burned by those who are poor by choice, or they're, however you want to word that, illegitimately poor. I don't know how you want to put that. But then there are those who are legitimately poor, and they have real needs, and that's what we're called to help with. And so that's one of those issues. It's a practical question that really needs discussion. It needs thought. But I wanted to show you that that's true biblically. I mean, this is something that's always been true as far as the biblical record goes. In Leviticus 25:35, let's turn there and just look at that real quick. Because God had a great concern for the poor when he gave his law to Israel. And he was very clear with them what their obligations were to the poor. But this is one of those statements that indicates a certain kind of poverty.
Brian, what was that in Leviticus? What?
25, verse 35.
Thank you.
So if we could have one person who has the NIV read it and then one person in the NLT read it, there's different wording that I think is helpful.
Yeah, I have been reading the version.
Okay, will you read that one, the NIV? Go ahead.
If one of your countrymen becomes poor and is unable to support himself among you, help him as you would an alien or a temporary resident, so he can continue to live among you. Okay,
so in the NIV it says if they become poor. That doesn't really clarify how they became poor, but you get the idea that it wasn't, they weren't being idiots, or they weren't being immoral, they just, something bad happened. Does somebody have the NLT with that? Because they had an interesting phrasing for that.
If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident, and allow him to live with you.
Isn't that interesting? Their language there is falls into poverty. And that captured my attention when I read that version, because that paints a picture for you. It's almost like a pit that you didn't see, and you just, And that actually is an interesting way to describe what a lot of us have seen, even in our own country, in the last 8 years, since the 2008 collapse of a lot of things. I personally have known folks who fell into all kinds of trouble. They had their retirement in the stock market. Somebody in my family had their whole retirement. They were retiring, and that was supposed to set them for the rest of their life. And they ended up losing half of that, their house, because they had to pull from that to pay off the house that, lost value, and they didn't do anything. They followed the rules, they did what you're supposed to do, and it just fell into it, right? So that's something that's real. That happens to people. I used to serve in Lancaster. Our church would go once a month to serve at Grace Resource Center, which was like the community help center for people in need. And we were told in an orientation that you might see people here tonight that you go to school with, that you work with, and make sure that you do not look surprised to see them. Make sure that you don't shame them by acting like they shouldn't be here getting free food or something. And he said, you'd be amazed at the people that need our food. They don't all fit the bill that, you might conjure up in your mind of the disheveled, smelly, whatever, grumbler. They said, we've had people come through here who are PhDs from India, who had a great practice and a great life, decided to come to America, had to start from scratch. And they needed a free meal, So they're just trying to give us perspective. These aren't just all slobs coming through here, And that opened my eyes. If you asked me if that was true, I would have said yes. But just knowing that and seeing that coming through the line, it opens your eyes to the fact people aren't poor just because they're lazy or just because they don't want to be productive. Sometimes you actually fall into it. Yeah? So keeping that in mind, there's legitimate poverty out there. But then there's this. In Proverbs, 3 specific places I wanted to look at together. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 13. Let's start there. Because what the wise man Solomon points out is there are consequences to being a fool. Poverty is actually one of them that he brings up several times. So there is a poverty that is actually your own fault because you've been foolish. You haven't lived according to the rules of life. So this is Proverbs 20, verse 13. Would somebody read that?
Do not love sleep, or you will grow poor. Stay awake, and you will have food to spare.
Do not love sleep, or you'll grow poor. What does that mean, to love sleep? What do you think?
Being lazy?
Uh-huh. I just don't want to get out of bed. That's all. I'm so comfortable. I don't feel like it. Yeah. And that's different than somebody might experience depression or something and they just really have a hard time getting the wherewithal to get out of bed. That's different than, I just don't want to get up and do anything. That's all. And man, the summertime lazies for kids, especially students, is like crazy, get out of bed. Just because you're not in school doesn't mean there's nothing going on in the world, So that's a warning. If you're a lazy person who isn't productive, purposefully getting up with purpose every day, you're going to end up poor. That's the way the world works. And then look at Proverbs 21, just one chapter over. Would somebody read 21:17, verse 17?
Whoever loves pleasure will become poor. Whoever loves wine and olive oil will never be rich.
Loving pleasure. Isn't that an American thing? To have plenty of income and end up with nothing because you've spent it all on just stuff you like, stuff to eat, stuff to drink, stuff to whatever. I know a man in Lancaster who jack of all trades, has done all kinds of things. I can't remember which job he was doing at the time, but he had mentioned to me he was working in this neighborhood, particularly either on a house or just in front of a house, I can't remember. and maybe it was plumbing. And he said, it's a beautiful house. Like, it was the nice neighborhood. Beautiful cars, clean and shiny in the driveway. And so as he's working outside the house, he's super impressed. And he said, for some reason, I can't remember why, he had to go into the house one time, either to use the phone or whatever. And he said, I was shocked because I went in and there was no furniture. There's nothing in the house. They couldn't enjoy their house because they had to use all their money just to get the thing, you know. And they're paying all these car payments. And he's like, what is that about? Why would you want that? You can't even enjoy anything you have because you spent all your money on it. And that's what this makes me think of. You say, oh, they're not poor. Look at all that stuff they have. But they're living poor. You know, I can't even sit on a chair because I spent all my money on my car. And I think Solomon's right. We don't mean you're living in a dumpster. We just mean you can't really live that way. It's not really living. So that's actually a certain form of poverty. There are also those, by the way, and again, we don't want to just broad brush this, but it's actually true. There are those people who are in real need, and even when they get help, they squander it just on stuff they want. And, you know, you almost think, is it because they think life is hard, I just need something to enjoy, you know, and maybe that's why, I don't know. But Solomon's words ring true. If you're just always about getting, and enjoying, that's not wise. You're going to end up poor. By the way, the other American, it's not just American, but the other modern phenomenon is the credit card. You end up a pauper, not in terms of lifestyle, but in terms of you have nothing. You actually are way in the hole. You own nothing. Everyone else owns what you have because you owe them. And that's the same thing. Why do you charge a lot of times? Sometimes it's survival, but a lot of times it's I want. And so we maybe wouldn't say, which verse was this? 17. We maybe wouldn't say wine and olive oil. That was the ancient equivalent of what we have. Whatever's nice. Keeping up with the Joneses, you know, putting on a good face. Oh, terrible. And then chapter 23, verse 21. Would somebody read? Actually, verses 20 and 21. Would somebody read those two verses?
Do not carouse with drunkards or feast with gluttons, for they are on their way to poverty, and too much sleep clothes them in rags.
Yep. So laziness can be a problem. An insatiable appetite for stuff can be a problem, and as he points out here, an insatiable appetite for food and drink, particularly alcohol. That'll mess you up in a lot of ways. But maybe you know people who dump, all their discretionary money into stuff like that. Addictions. It could be drugs, it could be food, it could be drink, whatever it is. Yep. So Solomon, he knew. By the way, that was a man with more wealth than, I don't know, anyone else can imagine that kind of wealth. Do you remember that the description in Kings of Solomon's wealth said that he had so much wealth coming into Israel, silver became something of no value? It was so much silver running into the kingdom. It was almost like, you just put that in the street, It's like crazy. So this man knew wealth. And I think he knew enough people who had wealth that just totally squandered it. He knew what he was talking about. To him, this isn't just theory. He's just describing life the way he was seeing it. So just as something to keep in mind as we look at what we're about to study in the Old Testament, when God is talking about the poor, what we're talking about is that first category of those who are poor legitimately. They just fell into this, or this is just something that has happened to them. They may have made a bad choice, but it was in good conscience. Maybe they as actually Solomon talks about this in his Proverbs as well. Maybe they put themselves up for someone else's loan. You maybe have read that in the Proverbs. And Solomon warned against that too, because he said, you can get in trouble. You pledge yourself for somebody else and it falls through. And again, you did it with a good conscience. You weren't being evil. You just maybe took a misstep. So that's what we're talking about here. So that doesn't answer all the questions that come up about, well, how do we know who's who? How do we know if we're helping someone who's legitimately in need versus someone who's working the system or pulling the wool over our eyes? And here's the danger I think we find ourselves in. We hear enough stories of that happening, and so we just assume that that's always happened. And we kind of get jaded. We kind of think, well, I don't want to be taken for a sucker, so never mind. And that's what this study won't allow us to do, I think. It won't give us that permission to just dismiss all cases based on a few. But it calls for wisdom. But I will say this, and C.S. Lewis said something to this effect. I won't quote him because I can't remember his quote. But basically, it was something to the effect of, when I reach the end of my days, I will not lose a single bit of comfort or sleep thinking that I was taken for a fool by somebody. But I will be terribly distressed to think that I ever turned someone who really needed me away. Terrible paraphrase, but that's the basic idea. And I agree with him. I've actually experienced that. Whenever you're the leader of a church, you're the one that hears the phone calls about needing help and stuff. And I've kind of found that to be true. I have been taken as a fool, kind of knowingly. Sometimes you just, okay. You try your best not to be, but you are sometimes. But I've never really lost any sleep over that. It's kind of like, all right, well, I'll try to be wiser next time. But to think that someone legitimately needed me and I just said, no, because there's a chance that you're going to, take advantage of me. That would bother me. That would sear my conscience. So I get what C.S. Lewis meant by that. Any thoughts on that issue? Because I know that's probably something we all deal with. Trying to discern those things. How do I know who to help? Any reflections? All right. Well, let's jump in because there's a lot here. And I put them in bullet points, which is helpful to organize things. But here's the job back. There are all these Bible references in parentheses, right? And it's just this big pile of Bible verses. So I know my temptation when I get this stuff from people is be like, oh, so there's a lot of Bible verses about that. Fine. And I never look them up. I don't, they're just a pile of Bible verses. So just to acknowledge that danger of my formatting it this way, I actually wanted to go through all the Bible verses together. You just run out of time is the problem. So I just wanted to encourage you, do use this as a reference to actually read these scriptures, look them up. I appreciate that people just take my word for it, that, my bullet point summaries are accurate. But there's so much richness in these passages. You just hear the heart of your Father in these passages. But just for organization and time's sake, I did kind of summarize the message of a lot of these. So here's God's heart throughout the Old Testament towards the poor. It says here that he raises them up and gives them honor. Now that reference from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, that's Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Are you familiar with this story? Hannah is a woman who is barren and desperately wants to give her husband children, particularly sons. And at that time, in that culture, to be a woman who cannot give her husband sons was a terrible shame on you. It was, and a lot of people considered you cursed by God. It was just one of those things you're supposed to do as a woman. You're supposed to give children to your husband and to society, And so she was feeling such a shame on her, and she was feeling so despondent. So remember, and by the way, the husband had a rival wife who was actually producing children. So that just added to the wound of this whole thing. Because she felt like she was the one that was loved, but she was the one that couldn't give the kids. It was terrible. So she cried out to God. She went to the there was no temple yet. She went to the tabernacle in Shiloh. And the high priest, Eli, was there. And she was so distraught. She's crying out to God. And it says she was kind of mumbling. Just like this.
She was drunk.
Yeah, and he's watching from a distance, and he's like, what's this drunk lady coming to the tabernacle? What is she doing? And she said, no, I'm not drunk. And told the story. I'm just asking God. Now, there's a powerful thing here. Eli, as the high priest, speaks a blessing over her and says, "May the Lord grant you what you've asked. May it be done to you." Well, sure enough, God honored that blessing, and she comes to know that she's pregnant. She's with child. And just like Mary does in the New Testament when she finds out she's going to have the Son of God, wow, Hannah bursts out in this prophetic song of praise to God. And one of the things she says about God is this: He raises up the poor and seats them in places of honor. Now, in her mind, that's true of God's character overall, but she saw herself as the poor one. Not poor financially, of course, but poor in this one need. I have no children. I'm poor in children. I'm poor in this function. And so she saw God taking this poor woman and seating her in honor because He gave her a miracle, this child, right? Just a beautiful thing. That's why I'm saying if you don't read them, you're missing out on this wonderful nuance of who God is. But Psalm 113:7 echoes the same idea. God takes those who are lowly and He exalts them. In Job and in Job 34, Psalm 69, we see that God hears the cry of the poor. Now, this is actually a pretty nuanced thing. Like, why are the poor crying out? Several reasons. One is they could be hungry. That's a very true thing. Particularly in that society. They didn't have all the safety nets we have now. Not that all the safety nets work for everybody the best, but we have safety nets in our society for the poor. If people just didn't help them, tough, you know? It's like if you own nothing, if you have no levers to pull in society, you're at everyone's mercy and you cry out to God. You're hungry, your kids are hungry. The other thing is, and we're going to see this all the way through the Old Testament, one of God's greatest concerns for the poor is that the rich and the powerful would step on them, exploit them, mistreat them. Because they could. Because they're bullies. You know, and that's what bullies do. And so this crying out also has to do with that. Crying out to God because I can't stop them from doing this to me. I'm powerless against these strong people. God hears those cries too. So just that picture of Father who is so important. He's so big and strong and rich, and, you know, He has no need of any of us. He's fine on His throne. And yet He is so tender-hearted. When they cry out, oh, He's all ears. You know, He hears them as soon as they cry to Him. That's such a precious picture. Psalm 9, Isaiah 41, we see that God says this. Oh, it's so beautiful. He promises the poor He will never forget them. He will never forget them. Now, to me, that strikes me as significant because the poor are easy to forget when you're living your middle class or your rich life. You know, they don't have to be on your radar at all. In fact, I've known folks that kind of wish the poor would just go away, you know, like, get out of my area, just let me enjoy my nice life. Do I have to see you? It's easy to forget them. Some people want to forget them, but listen to that. God is the richest. God is the most powerful being in the entire universe, and yet He says, I won't forget you. I want to remember you. I'm decidedly going to keep you in mind, poor people. Oh. And so any rich person, any powerful person who knows that about God gets an instant rebuke if they want to just get those poor people out of here. I've seen this of the homeless. And I sympathize with people who aren't comfortable with that issue. But when you see people as just a blight that needs to be dealt with, I mean, we're walking directly away from the heart that Jesus is saying we're meant to have in righteousness, where people are valued and important. So that the fact that God says, I'll never forget the poor, I think that's beautiful. Psalm 12:5, God promises this, I will protect the poor. I'll protect them. I tell you, when God Himself commits to be your protector, that's a boost in confidence right there. You know, God's my warrior. God's going to be my defender. Similar idea in the next one, Psalm 14:6, Isaiah 25:4. God promises to be their refuge. And protection is what refuge is all about, right? So, when the poor are being oppressed, when the poor are being mistreated or exploited, or they're hungry, whatever it is, God's telling them, you come to me. You call on me. Because even if everyone else abandons you, I won't. I'm on your side.
It's weird because I just read this week. I was going over some stuff, and it has to deal with that. This is God taking care of the poor. It says, trust in the Lord always. This is Isaiah 26. For the Lord God is the eternal rock. He humbles the proud, brings down the arrogant cities, and brings it down to dust. The poor and oppressed trample on it underfoot, and the needy walk all over it. So, and it was weird because I was seeing some of this corruption in our government, reading about it this week, and then I just happened to read that. I'm like, wow, is that what's happening today? Is things turning around, because of all the corruption in our government, and then in the world? So, it's good time. Yeah.
Yeah,
Takes care of them.
The problems we see, and you can vilify people that have power and money too far also, but it's hard to ignore from ancient times to modern times. Those with power and with wealth have such a temptation to misuse that to get more. And how do you do that? Well, you got to step on somebody. Who do you step on? Whoever's easiest to step on. It's those poor people that can't do anything about it, And again, I don't think everybody with money and power is that way. That's ridiculous. But there's got to be some who are. That's just the way the world's always been. So, you can't assume that everyone's using it properly either. Yeah. And the more I've been looking at this and meditating on this, the more I realized we're going to get there on the next page, but I haven't really been concerned enough about it, I've just kind of carried on with my own thing, and God will take care of it, and I just kind of tunnel vision in my own situation. And I'll help when the need arises in my own situation and all that, but what the Lord's really challenged me to do here is to open my view to the big picture of what He's concerned with. The weight of His responsibility as the King of all things goes beyond my own little life. I'm so glad it includes my little life, but the weight of responsibility on my King is so massive, and He just wants His kids to join Him in the bigger view. He wants us to become like Him. He wants us to see the way He does. And I tell you, this study has been doing that for me. Ooh, boy. Because of things like what you just read. He says in Psalm 35, Psalm 72, He rescues them, the poor, from those who are stronger. That's what we've been talking about. The ones who want to exploit, take advantage. And remember, the poor can't do anything about it. That's one of the elements of being poor. You have no power. You have no strings to pull. You can't bribe anybody, And remember the story of Jesus, or the story Jesus told. And Luke told us it was to make a point about prayer, to always pray and never give up. But the story was of the widow who went to the judge, who didn't care about God or people. Do you remember this? And she needed the judge to do something to help her get justice. There was a really unfair thing happening in her life. And she can't do anything about it because she's a poor widow. What's she going to do? So she's doing the only thing she can do, going to a judge, because he does have power. And his role in the whole society is to accomplish justice, for rich or poor. That's his whole job, right? But because he doesn't care about God or man, when she comes with this need, he's like, go away. Kind of that, you're gross and poor. And so she goes away. But what does she do the next day? Judge, I need your help. You're the only one that can help me. Please go away. She goes away. Next day. Judge, every day she comes back. And you remember what Jesus said. The only reason He eventually helps her is why?
So that she won't come back.
He got tired of her. He said, the only way to get this woman out of my hair is to do what she's asking. Fine. But Jesus, He wasn't just being cheeky. He knew that's how a lot of things are in this world. Even people entrusted with the job of accomplishing justice, if you aren't going to make it worth their while, they don't have the time of day for you. And God said, well, I'm going to make sure that you are dealt with if you do that to my poor people, because that is so wicked and so wrong. It wasn't exactly the same thing, but I was reminded of this. We watched, as a family, the movie Miracles from Heaven last night. Super good. Better than I thought it was going to be, actually. But to see the persistence of the mom in that, because she's being denied the only hope that she knows of for her daughter, who's in really bad shape. And the scenes were really well done, but she's on the phone. And she's asking about, have you gotten hold of the doctor? What does the doctor say? He hasn't said anything yet. Since the last time I talked to you, ma'am. Like the woman on the other side of the phone is so annoyed she's calling again. And she said, okay, I'll call you tomorrow then. I was like, yes, that's exactly it. But anyways, God's not going to put up with that. He'll protect and rescue from those who want to harm the poor. In Psalm 68, Psalm 132, God says, I'll provide for them. Now you read that and you think, well, does he though? There's a lot of poor people who don't have. But remember, when God makes these promises, it's not a blanket, unconditional statement. He's speaking of those who cry out to him. So this is definitely a statement of the poor who turn to me, who rely on me. Now that doesn't mean he won't take care of others, because remember, Jesus told us he's kind to the righteous and the unrighteous alike. So God actually does show kindness to all the poor. But if you ever see God promising to do something and you're like, but I'm not sure that always happens for poor people, do remember that this is specifically those poor who are looking to him. He will never fail them. So he said, I'll provide for them. In fact, it was David, I think in the Psalms, who said, I've never seen a righteous man go hungry. And we're like, is that right? Because Paul the Apostle says, as a servant of Jesus, he knew what it was to go hungry. He knew what it was to have plenty to eat, So, is that right? Well, the point is, even if you're hungry, you're not going to die. Because God, even if you go hungry for this amount of time, God's going to meet that need. One really powerful story that this reminds me of is this man, what's his name now? It's a ethnic sounding name that I once knew and I can't remember it now. But he started the organization Gospel for Asia. Thought I had it, but I don't. Anyway, he told the story in his book he wrote, his testimony, that when he started this organization, because he was sure God wanted him to, he had given up his ministry to do it, and that income that comes with that. And he was just trusting the Lord. He said, okay, Lord, this is what you want me to do. And so he was describing how he and his wife and kids, he's got a family, are in their home. They've come to America for this because he went to Bible training and all that, and then ministry and all that. So now he still kind of feels like a stranger here in America. He's in this house and they're out of food. And his wife's kind of like, we're in trouble here. The kids are hungry. They're complaining about you hungry. I have nothing to give them. And he's supposed to be the provider, so this is a problem. And so he starts to wonder, did I misunderstand you, God? We were so sure you want us to do this, but it looks like this isn't what we're supposed to be doing because we don't have what we need. So his wife kind of encouraged him, and so they just prayed together. Within the hour, they hear this knock on the door. And there's these people outside the door with arms full of groceries. So we don't understand all this because they didn't know these people. They didn't tell anyone their need. They were strangers in the area. They didn't know anybody anyway. So we can't explain it, but we had a really strong sense that we're supposed to bring groceries to this house. Here. And of course they're just like, what? And so, they've got a week or two worth of groceries instantly at their door because they just trusted the Father. That's what I think of. I'll provide for the poor. When they call out to me, when they ask me, I'll do that. But notice how God did it. It wasn't with ravens like with Elijah. It wasn't some weird supernatural thing. How did God pull it off? His people. People who felt his call and obeyed. That's the second part of our study.
I had
our role in this thing.
A friend at work, before he started working with us, him and his wife had 2 kids, out of work, struggling, and they were in the parking lot at Walmart. And it's like, okay, we need formula, we need diapers, here's enough money, get what you can get, and it's like, okay, I'll decide on how many diapers I can get or how many bottles of formula. So the husband the gentleman I work with went into the Walmart with one kid while the wife was staying in the car with the infant. And she said she was watching across the parking lot and seeing this gentleman just wandering back and forth between the cars, getting closer. And she said she actually got scared because wasn't dressed real well, and just looked sort of scruffy. And he eventually come up to their vehicle, tapped on the window, and she cracked the window a little bit. And he gave her an envelope, said, "God told me to give this to you." And there was enough money in that envelope to go get the groceries that they needed. And that was about 3 years ago, so he still works like that today.
You bet. You bet. Isn't it wonderful when you read this and you find out, oh my gosh, he does that. He really does. Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. Oh, always share those stories, please. Always share them. Psalm 82, Psalm 140, Jeremiah 22. God promises He will uphold the cause and secure justice for the poor. Again, we're back to when people try to exploit them, railroad them in court. By the way, it's always been easy to railroad the poor in court. They can't afford a lawyer. What do you mean? You can manhandle the poor in court because you've got power and influence and all that. Which is, by the way, why God made such a huge point of this in His law when He told them over and over again in Israel, in your court system, you will not give an advantage to the poor because they're poor, nor will you give a disadvantage to the poor for the poor. You just give justice. That's all. Rich or poor, you hold them to the standard. Because God knows how it works. It's easy to take advantage of the poor in a court. So anyways, He says, I'll uphold their cause. If you think they don't have representation, you're wrong. I'm their representation, and I'll take their case. Oh, watch out. Psalm 82, Isaiah 3, Jeremiah 2, Jeremiah 5. God says that He's judging earthly leaders who use their leadership to mistreat the poor. In fact, in Psalm 82, it's an interesting picture. Let's turn there, just because the picture painted by the psalmist is pretty powerful. Psalm 82. And this is what I want us to always have in mind of God as the shepherd of the universe. He takes His role very seriously. For a long time, this was a mysterious passage to me. I think I'm coming to understand its real gist here. This is Asaph writing, not David. Asaph was writing a psalm here. He said, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the, quote, gods. I just didn't understand what that meant. Who are these gods? I thought God was the only God. What are they talking about? Well, as we go on, we'll find out who the gods are. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? The true God is saying that to the little gods. We still don't know who they are yet, but listen to what He says to the little gods. Verse 3. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. This is God talking to the little gods, right? And you're still like, well, who are they? Look at verse 5. The little gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Still don't know who they are. Verse 6. I said, you are little gods. You are all sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Oh. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. What Asaph was seeing is the rulers of the earth wield power like little gods. And the great God of heaven gathers all these rulers of earth together and kind of gives them a finger in the face. I have given you all this power on this world to do my work, and look at what you're doing with it. Get your act together and help the poor, will you? Get the act together and protect the weak. And then this terrible commentary in verse 5. These gods, they don't know anything. They don't understand anything. Is this not a section of Scripture you can carry around with you these days? What is with the gods of it? What is wrong with these people? And you kind of wish God would corral them all into a room and give them a good stern talking to, don't you? Oh, my. So we get what Asaph's getting. We understand what he's saying about that. Anyway, God's very much taking earthly leaders to task for how they treat the poor or how they don't treat them. In Psalm 109, there's a beautiful picture. Oh, I love it. Psalm 109:31. God says that he stands at the right hand of the poor in order to save them. Now, this at the right hand thing is really significant. I don't know if you remember, Jesus sits at God's right hand. What do you understand that to mean? What's with the right hand?
Position of honor.
Good. And very often for royalty. Of course, we have our own thing, the right-hand man. Like, we get this. It's your most trusted and it's your most reliable person. And so for God the Father to have Jesus at his right hand is to say, I can trust my boy with everything. In fact, he did. He turned all of his affairs over to Jesus to take care of it for him. Joseph was the right-hand man of Pharaoh in his story. Haman, was the right-hand man of the emperor of Persia in his story, in Esther. Later it became Mordecai, which was a better choice. So the right hand is the place where you can trust that person with your affairs, and they're always going to do the right thing for you. So think of how condescending, I mean in a good way, God is here. Because the poor aren't royalty. The royal ones are the ones that have a right-hand man. But God said, I'll be their right-hand man. You're the king of everything, and you're lowering yourself to be the right-hand man of poor people? Oh, man. That's powerful. That imagery speaks so much of God's heart. That the most exalted being in the universe is so humble and so loving to this easily dismissed group of people, the poor. I love it. And all these references in Ezekiel 16, 18, and 22, in Amos 2, 4, 5, and 8, in Zechariah 7, God says, I know your mistreatment. Bye, brother. That's it. I know how people are treating you. I know that they're not treating you as they are meant to. I'm going to handle this. And he's calling them out. You go read those scriptures. God's calling out the people on earth for how they're mistreating the poor. And remember, he promised he'd do that. He said, I'll take up their cause. I'll defend them. And he proves it in that prophets. He's like, I see it, guys. I'm not blind to how you're treating these poor people. So that's God's heart. And you think to yourself, if I really believe that, it's not that hard to figure out how to treat the poor myself. Like, I can put the pieces together how I'm supposed to treat the poor. But just so there's no misunderstanding, God gives us a lot of clarity of what our role is in this whole thing. So that's what this next page is about. The one under the title, The Way of the Righteous. Now, as we look at these, keep in mind that God is the high king, the shepherd of this world. As we've already said, he primarily prefers to work through his ministers. And I don't mean professional badge-wearing ministers, I'm talking about his people, all his servants. So, a lot of kingdoms have ministries, or that's more of a European thing, ministries. In America, we have departments, right? We have department heads and all that stuff. And so in any kingdom or in any government, the head, doesn't do everything personally. He uses his ministers and servants to get it done. But it's still the king accomplishing it, because he's issuing the orders. Well, this is very much what we're going to see here. God promised to do all these things that we've already looked at. But here's the thing. He assigns this work to his servants. That's us. That's why what we're looking at is so crucial. When God says He'll provide for the poor, He's primarily going to do it through us. And if we're too busy or too important or whatever we are to do it, we are actually making God look bad in a lot of ways. Because the poor will look at God and say, "What? You said you were going to provide for me?" And He said, "I know, I was trying." They wouldn't cooperate. And so our actions are actually not just reflecting on our character, but on the character of God. This is huge. Oh my gosh. The more I was looking at this, the more I realized this is a big deal. This is something I have to take seriously. So, let's look at what God said to His servants, His people, about how to do His work His way, to make sure that His promises are kept to His people. You can see the first one there in Exodus 22, Psalm 15, Proverbs 28, Ezekiel 18, all the way through. This is a really big one. When there's somebody that's come on hard times and needs to borrow money from you, you lend them the money, but do not charge interest. Now, why do you think that's so important to not charge interest in that moment?
It's extra expense for them.
Yeah. And you're benefiting from someone else's misfortune. Oh, you need a little help, do ya? You ever heard that phrase, you got someone over a barrel? What a picture. Oh, my goodness. But yeah, you're desperate, are you? Oh, maybe I can make a 15% profit on this, and it's that miserly, so sad for you, but good for me. And that's what God's like, no, oh, gross, disgusting, how dare you? No, when someone's in a bad spot, you just help them, that's all. Just help them. Don't try to get anything out of it. And He would really come down on folks who took advantage of those moments. He really came down hard. The next one, this is Proverbs 14, Proverbs 28, Proverbs 14, 19, 22, 28. Whoa, Proverbs has a lot to say about this one. And this is, again, my summary statement. You should really go read the actual statements by Solomon. But those who are kind to the poor and needy, God promised to bless them. He promised to reward them. God personally will. In fact, Solomon went so far as to say that when you give to the poor, you are lending to God. I was actually bothered by that language. I'm like, I don't owe God anything, and He doesn't owe me anything. Sorry, that was a slip. I owe Him everything. But God doesn't owe me anything. And if I give to the poor, I'm not even beginning to repay what I owe Him. So there's no way I can call it lending to God. I thought, why would you say that, Solomon? Like, you're smarter than I am. Why would you say that? And what I think, he purposefully said something outrageous to make his point. God considers it personally a favor to Him for you to care for the poor. And Solomon promised He'll repay you. Just like as if it was a debt, He'll repay you. How wonderful. Now, of course, the twisted in the heart would say, oh, good, God's going to be indebted to me here, poor people. And you can be a selfish jerk still, but obviously we're not that kind of people. So just think about that. God, the wisdom He gave Solomon led to that wording. You're lending to God. Wow. Proverbs 14:31, that was in the last bullet point also. Proverbs 19:17 is also in the last bullet point. But the thing here is that God considers it a reflection on your view of Him, how you treat the poor. In fact, let's look at these just because they pop up a couple times here. Let's go to Proverbs 14:31. Because however we feel about the poor, we all know that our relationship to God is of utmost importance. So these kinds of statements really bring the point home. Would somebody read that when you get there? Proverbs 14, verse 31.
Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God.
Wow. Contempt? That's serious language right there. You oppress the poor, you show contempt for the one who made them. But, good news. If you're kind to the needy, you're showing an honor for God. Isn't that significant? That your view or treatment of the poor actually reflects on your view of God. My goodness. And then this other one is 1917. Let's look at that one. It kind of reiterates the same point.
Kindness to the poor is a loan to the Lord, and he will give a reward to the lender.
He'll pay you with interest. You know, you get that idea that he's so pleased by it that he'll want to reward you for that. There's a good on you in there. So yeah, I mean, wow, that's enough to get us to realize this is a big deal. Proverbs 21, Proverbs 28 in our next one. Those who ignore the poor will be cursed and will be ignored in their time of need. Ouch. So someone comes to you asking for help, you're like, sorry, can't right now, go away. Hope someone else can help you. Okay. You ignored them. And again, this is not a promise every time this is going to happen this way, but generally this is how it works. You turn your back on the poor when you have need at some time come up. And this isn't karma, okay? This isn't just universal boomerangs. This is God's order of things. You're gonna suffer that because He wants you to learn the injustice of what you've done. So you're gonna find you're in a need, and people won't be there for you. And He just straight up says you'll be cursed. I mean, that's about as blunt as it gets. God Himself will curse you. And by the way, others will curse you. People will curse you. If you're not generous, if you're a real miserly jerk, people curse your name. You know, that kind of thing. The old Scrooge syndrome. Was it in that story? I only know the movie versions, so forgive me. But in that story of... what's it called now? All I can think of is The Night Before Christmas. Christmas Carol. Thank you. In the Christmas Carol, doesn't Scrooge come to realize the way people view him? Like he gets this inside track of the way people speak of him. And that's a real thing. You know, if you're generous, you enjoy the blessing of people and God. But if you're that way, there is a curse. Proverbs 29:7. I actually just put the whole verse here because Proverbs are pithy, but it's on your page. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. The righteous care about justice for the poor. This one, this one was biting to me because, like, I'm happy to help the poor. I've done that, but when I read this, I thought, do I have a concern for the justice for the poor? Does that even cross my mind? And I'll be honest with you, this is personal confession. When I hear justice for the poor, I think of a liberal agenda. I think of social justice things and picketing and all that stuff. And so I kind of dismiss it as a political thing. But the more you look into this and the more you see God's heart for it, you realize this is real. Maybe I have something to learn from some of the liberal agenda of there are real wrongs out there towards the poor, towards the powerless. There are real issues that need to be brought up and spoken about. So this was one of those loving rebukes from the Lord, for me at least. If I don't have concern for justice for the poor, that's an area I need to grow in. That's something that's the heart of God. And if I don't have that heart, okay, it's time to repent of that and move forward. And again, it's one of those where, well, if it's not on my radar, is it really something I'm going to be accountable for? That's okay, that was going through my head. Well, Lord, if it's on my radar, I'll of course care about it. And He's like, well, this is on your radar now. There's a big blip on the radar now, buddy. I was like, oh, you're right. Okay. So yeah, I want to pay attention. We need to pay attention as His people in the kingdom of God, which the kingdom of the world isn't there, but we are the kingdom of God present in this world. And if the churches don't point out these things, someone else might. But then we've missed this opportunity to show the world the kingdom of God is right. His ways are best. And so we do need to have a voice out there about this stuff. I see here in Proverbs 31:9 that we're told to defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Same idea. You defend the rights, because no one else will. It's not, they don't have the money to pay anybody. Now, of course, in our government, I think it's a pretty cool thing that our government will provide you with representation if you're too poor to provide it for yourself. Of course, if the TV shows I watch are accurate, they're overloaded to the point where they may not give you the best representation anyway. Not because they don't want to, but because they've got 85 other people to handle, you know. So yeah, the role of the righteous ones to step up and say, I want to be on your side. If your cause is righteous, I mean, if you're really guilty, you know, okay, our obligation isn't to try to get those people off. Because remember, whether you're rich or poor, justice is the issue. Not, oh, I feel bad. You broke a law, but you're poor, so, you know, we'll overlook it. But if your cause is righteous and you're poor and you can't get representation, I want to step up and help you. The noble woman in Proverbs 31, the praiseworthy woman. I know this is a passage a lot of women dread. The Proverbs 31 woman, because she seems like a superhero. Like, I can't compete with this woman. She doesn't ever sleep. She's always working. She provides for her family, for the poor. She runs a business. You know, who is this lady? Well, take heart. You don't have to be Superwoman, but it shows some of the virtues of godliness. I think whether for a man or a woman, to tell you the truth, but specifically the woman. And notice this is one thing that the man described about her. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. This woman is so kind-hearted, so open and generous to anyone she sees who has need. I totally picture this in a home setting. And I've heard of people doing this, and our family, you know, has tried to do this when the need arises, but especially when you have a large family, it almost doesn't add up mathematically. And I've heard a lot of stories to this effect. You know, they have their meal, they got a bunch of kids, they don't have a lot of money, so they're kind of eating simply. And a bunch of folks show up just from the neighborhood or from wherever, the kids' friends show up at dinner time. And the mom and the dad says, you guys want to join us for a meal? Sure, thanks. Come on in. And they sit around the meal. And while usually they don't have any leftovers, I've heard this so many times, it's almost like the multiplication of foods by Jesus. When they usually don't have leftovers just for their family, now that they've added 5 extra people to the meal, they have leftovers somehow. And you're like, that doesn't add up. How did that work? I don't know. But it makes you wonder, does God just bless your generosity? He smiles on it, and so you have more than you need? I think it's great. But that's the noble woman and the noble man. Anyone who owns a home, who has food on the table, when you know somebody has need, open your arms to them, extend your hand to them. Now, I told you we were focusing on the Old Testament, but I've got to mention this right here. Jesus, in the book of Luke, we read about this. He was at dinner with folks. I think I've mentioned this before, but he was watching this. It's kind of like a business dinner, okay? So the important people were invited. And a social dinner. And so Jesus is kind of, and it says in the text, he's just kind of watching everybody. He's watching them try to find the most important seats at the table, to get the most important position and all this stuff. And he takes a chance to teach them about humbling yourself and choosing the lower seat and all that. And it says he keeps watching them. And later on in the dinner, by the way, he is somebody's guest at this dinner. And later on in the dinner, after watching all this go on, I'm sure he's rather irritated by the whole thing, but he says to his host, remember, he was generously invited to come to this dinner, but he says to his host, you know, when you throw a banquet like this, you should invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, people that can't repay you. Don't invite all your friends that are going to invite you to their party tomorrow. Invite people that can't do anything for you, and the Father will reward you at the resurrection. And I was thinking of that, I thought, that's kind of gutsy, Jesus. Like, you're his guest in his house. and you're telling him how to do it better. Like, wow. But I think of the same thing. This woman in Proverbs 31 isn't just opening her arms to her buddies and her, her friends and all that. She's opening it to those who really need it. Not just for a social good time, but to eat, to have. And I thought a lot about that as church life. Because we have potlucks and stuff. I love that about church life. You're together. And the early churches did that. We've always done that as people. We've always eaten together and shared time together. But I have thought about that. What if we as the church did that exact thing? We threw a banquet. And I mean, and this might come up later, by the way, as a real idea. Like went all out, not just threw down the cheapy stuff because, I just poor people, but really went all out. Maybe had nice tablecloths, even had guys and women serving with a little cloth over their arm, and all that. But and we went around, and anyone who had any inkling was just really struggling. We just said, hey, we'd love to invite you to our banquet. Use that word banquet, lavish. And even have maybe some nice invites put up. And special honored guests, Maybe even chauffeur them, or I don't know, however. But just show them honor, show them love, give them a wonderful meal. And see, the goal here isn't to get them to come to church. Though, of course, when people love you, you kind of naturally want more of that, but that's not the goal. The goal isn't to try to drum up publicity. You don't go tell the newspaper this wonderful thing you're going to do. Wouldn't that violate everything Jesus is teaching us? No. Low key, under the radar, just to bless these folks. And remember what Jesus said, Father sees. He'll reward you. It's going to be great. So those are the kinds of things I think this was teaching us. Open arms, extended hands, not to get anything, just to bless. Isaiah 58 is a really important passage. This is one definitely not to skip over. I only gave you one little snippet of that. But what God said to Israel is that He gave them these fasts in His law. There's certain times of year you fast. You go without food as a part of your worship. And they did that. They not always, but overall they did that dutifully because it's part of being righteous. But in Isaiah 58, God gives them a very powerful rebuke and a correction. And He says, you think that just not eating is what I'm looking for. He says, let me tell you the real fast that I'm looking for you. This is what fasting really looks like in my eyes. And it's a long section, but this is one part of it. He says, true and acceptable fasting is sharing your food with the hungry, is giving shelter to the poor wanderer, and is clothing the naked. That's fasting. It's not just you going without, it's you going without as you provide it for the other. Now, if you were to circle the main ideas here, the hungry, one needing shelter, and the naked. It's interesting, when you turn to Matthew 25, go ahead and do that with me. Go to Matthew 25. Starting in verse 31. And Jesus, this is some of His last teaching before His arrest and suffering and death. He says, when the King comes in His glory, He's going to gather all the nations, starting in verse 31. I don't know if I said that. He's going to gather all the nations together and start separating them, like a shepherd would separate sheep from goats. On the right will be the righteous ones. On the left will be the unrighteous, the wicked. Perhaps you're familiar with this, but do you remember what His litmus test was for separating them? Go to verse 34. Then the King will say to those on His right, these are the righteous ones, come you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. We could just savor those juices all day. That's so good. But why? Why did He count them the ones on His right hand? He said, for I was hungry. That's the same thing from Isaiah. And you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty. You gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, poor wanderer. You invited me in. I needed clothes. Same thing from Isaiah. And you clothe me. You almost get the idea Jesus may have had Isaiah's 58 passage in mind when he said this. He adds more, though. I was sick, you looked after me. I was in prison, you visited me. So Jesus, of course, has the Old Testament understanding of God's heart for the poor because that's his heart too. He's at one with the Father. He shares the heart of the Father. So just to point out, we can fast. This is going to be something we talk about later because Jesus brought it up again in Matthew 6. We can fast. We can go without food and find out that's not what God was looking for anyway. Not just that. It's something bigger. It's something of the heart. Last one on our bullet point list here. And oh my gosh, this one is significant to me because I know kind of the... I don't know if they're cliches yet, but some of the lines we throw around within the churches. When the Supreme Court ruled on the homosexual marriage issue, to make it a national law, I heard folks say, numerous, and different places, different people, but people are saying, we are now officially Sodom. That was the statement. And according to that logic, it's because of the homosexual issue that we, as a nation, are Sodom. And I remember hearing that going, I'm not sure you understand the Sodom issue. And part of the reason is this exact verse. Now, we connect Sodom to the homosexual rape that they wanted to inflict on the visitors, if you know that story, right? Lot had taken the angels into his house that were visiting, and the crowd from the town of Sodom comes around and insists that give us your visitors so we can have our way with them. So people really focus in on the homosexuality issue or the sexual issue. But listen to what God says about it. I mean, listen to his take on the whole Sodom problem. Because remember, he blew up Sodom and Gomorrah. They were so wicked. But because of the story in Genesis, we think they were wicked because of homosexuality. Well, look at what God said here through Ezekiel. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They didn't help the poor and needy. He didn't say anything about sex. He didn't say anything about anything like that. He said, my real problem with Sodom and Gomorrah, not that he was pleased with homosexual rape threats. I mean, that's just a symptom of the deeper issue. He said they were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned, and they didn't do anything to help the poor and the needy. That's really why God was upset at Sodom. Now, if you want to say America has become Sodom, say it because we fit this description, not because of that other thing. But what I wanted to point out is in that story, look earlier in the story to see where the real heart problem was of Sodom. So let's rewind the tape from that terrible moment when they're demanding that you send out your guests because we want to have our way with them. Rewind, come over here to Abraham. God has appeared to Abraham in visible physical form, which is kind of trippy, but it happened. Okay, so I don't know what that's about, but God shows up and he's got 2 angels with him. So there's 3 of them all together. And they're just passing through unassumingly, not announcing who they are, just as wanderers, strangers, passing through. And they're passing through where Abraham is, and do you remember Abraham's reaction when he sees them? As any righteous person should have done back then, he ran up to them and said, "Oh, my lords, come, let me take care of you," because you're always supposed to be hospitable. Strangers you're going through, it's your obligation to take care of them. So he says, "Oh, my lords, come, come, come." He has them sit down under a tree. And he says, "Let me go get you some food, let me get you some drink, let me take care of you." And so he does. And that's when God tells him, "This time next year, you're going to have a boy." And Sarah's over in the tent going, "Yeah, right." So all that goes down. Now, after this whole interview, God gets up, his angels get up, and they're going to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember God talks to his angels like, "Should we tell Abraham about it?" Okay. So he tells Abraham his plan is to go check out Sodom and Gomorrah to see if it's as bad as they say. People are talking to God about how bad they are. Again, crying out. And so God has heard the cries of the people against Sodom and Gomorrah. So he says, "Let's go check it out." And he says to Abraham, if they're wicked, I'm going to take them out. So remember what Abraham did? because he knew Lot was in Sodom. So he starts bargaining with God. Well, God, it doesn't seem right that you would kill righteous people along with wicked people. What if you found some righteous folks? 50. What if there's 50 righteous folks in the whole town? God said, okay, I won't destroy him if there's 50. And remember, he keeps bargaining him down. It was 5. It's 5, Hey, God's so patient. Oh, I love him. He's so kind. He's just talking. All right, Abraham. Okay, Abraham. Unfortunately, there's only one in the town, so they didn't meet the quota. But anyway, so the angels leave while God has this talk with Abraham. The angels leave and go, and they visit the town. And what it says is they were in the town square, if you call it that, at the town gates, as strangers, just waiting around. And no one in this whole town, and I don't know how big the town was, but there's hundreds of people at least. No one in the whole town thinks to do what Abraham did, which is say, oh, strangers, come, let me help you. No. They're just ignoring them, walking by them, pretending they're not there, and going about their business. And it takes till evening when Lot, the one righteous guy in the whole town, one sign of his righteousness is that when he came in from his long day of work, he saw these two standing there. It's starting to turn dusk, and he's like, what are you guys doing here? Well, we're just passing through. No one's had you go in their house yet? No one's taking care of you? Nah. Well, come to my house. Nah, we'll fine. We'll just pass through. No, you're coming to my house. So he insists they come. And he's going to give them food. Just like his uncle, Abraham, because he knows righteousness. Well, that's when this whole nasty business comes up of the crowd gathering outside. But you see, the unrighteousness happened before the crowd outside. It was their ignoring this needy two men who had nowhere to go. And that's why he says here, they didn't help the poor and the needy. I think that's why God had heard so much complaint about Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, they were sexually deviant and gross. Yeah, okay. But they weren't taking care of anybody. They were selfish and overfed. And I'll tell you, I was looking at these adjectives. Arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. Oh, man. If we are Sodom, it's because of those 3 things. Oh, that's not good. And truly, we stuff our faces. I'm not talking about you specifically, but as a culture. We don't have the problem of not enough to eat. We have the problem of having too much to eat, I got to say no because there's so many options to me. Which, again, it's not a curse on us to have affluence, praise God. But the question is, what have we done with it? And that's why that last word is so biting, unconcerned. Your overflow of food isn't reaching the ones who need it. Why? I don't know. Because I'm unconcerned. So this is heavy, and my point in going through this wasn't to condemn anyone or make anyone, feel rotten. But really, to me, it was just to make sure we as disciples are on the same page as Jesus. And if you are, wonderful, praise God, He'll reward you. If not, this is really, as in my case, a call to take the next step forward, to move ahead. Like I brought up last week, there's always the possibility that when we talk about the mature life, it can feel like an impossible thing. It can feel almost condemning because I can't measure up. So you wonder, am I not saved because of all this? Am I not saved because I don't care enough about the poor? And remember, we're disciples. Our salvation is found in the man Jesus because we trust Him. We trust Him to keep His promise. What this is all about is becoming more like Him. It's simply about growing to the next level of our maturity. And so, if you're like me and you're feeling a loving rebuke of Father, give Him thanks for the loving rebuke. Remember what Hebrews 12 says, and Proverbs said it before that. The Father only disciplines those He loves, His real, true children. So if you ever feel the sting of the truth, you're like, oh, Lord, I gotta refocus on this. Cool. Thanks for loving me, Father. You do care about me. You don't want to let me just go on in my ignorance. So take these things to heart. Last thing, and we're out of time here, but I do hope you'll read the last page. We're not going to go over it because of time's sake. But remember, Jesus came to fulfill the law. It wouldn't have been enough for Him to reiterate the Old Testament command to care for the poor. What he had to do was take it to the fullest level and say, care for the poor in secret. Do it for the right reason. Do it with a heart for Father. Now, Jesus wasn't the first one to think of this, but he had to make sure Israel got corrected on this because they had gone astray. People had done it right before Jesus said anything about it, but the majority of Israel was missing it. So he had to fulfill it. He had to bring it to its correct focus. And so we just love him for that. He's so smart and wise.